Good afternoon. It is Thursday afternoon, March 5th, March 6th. I'm Councilman Kevin Kramer, Chair of the Budget Committee. I'm joined in chambers by Councilman Owen, Councilman Hudson, Councilman Piagentini, Councilman Lininger, and Councilwoman Parrish Wright. I'm also joined online by Councilman Marcus Winkler, Councilwoman Woolridge, Councilwoman Parker, and Councilwoman McCraney. So we have a quorum. So, Madam Clerk, if you'd please read into the record the statement about.
This meeting is being held pursuant to KRS 61.826 and Council Rule 5A, read in full.
Great, thank you. A couple items on the agenda today. The first is related to the opioid settlement funds. It is an ordinance. It's 04225. It's an ordinance amending ordinance number 100, Series 2024, relating to the fiscal year 2024-2025 operating budget by appropriating $2,915,000 of opioid settlement funds for various purposes through the Department of Public Health and Wellness. Can I have a motion? Okay, it's properly before us. I've invited folks from the Health Department to come forward and speak to this. And if you would introduce yourself for the record, and then if you have a presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Inder Singhal. I'm the Executive Director of Metro Health, and I have Ben Goldman with me, Assistant Director of Harm Reduction Services at Metro Health. And we do have a short presentation. This has been going on for about 2 years, and it's going to continue. So we thought we can put together a short presentation reminding everyone what has happened so far and where we're heading. Ben?
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Council. Thank you, Dr. Singhal. So just a quick overview of how we got to where we are. The opioid settlement is being paid out by the distributors, manufacturers, and transporters of opioids, pharmaceuticals. These medications, it was not a comprehensive list of every company, so we do anticipate that more settlements will come in and additional payment will come in. Really, the harm that this abatement package points back to is that wave one, when we were experiencing an increase in prescription opioid overdose deaths. But it's important, and the settlement acknowledges this, that is no longer the world that we're in today. Right now, we are past wave one, where we were seeing opioid deaths related to prescription drugs, past wave two, when black tar heroin filled the vacancy left by the closing of all of the pill mills, past wave three, where heroin that was previously being sold was supplanted by synthetic opioids like fentanyl, and now we find ourselves in a fourth wave. This fourth wave is synthetic opioids like fentanyl in our entire illicit, unregulated drug supply. So that includes stimulants like cocaine and methamphetamine, as well as counterfeit pills that look like prescription pills, but are in fact deadly levels of opioids. So we have seen sort of the crest of this overdose crisis. We still are losing hundreds of our residents every year to fatal opioid overdoses. In both 2022 and 2023, our community saw a decrease in the overall number of residents dying of opioid overdose, but we saw an increase in the number of our black residents in Jefferson County who are dying of opioid overdoses in both of those years. 2024 data will be released soon. We are cautiously optimistic that we will see across-the-board decreases there, but it's all provisional data, so I will not report on that yet. So the settlement is really clear about what are allowable uses for these funds. They took a lesson away from the tobacco settlement, where a lot of that money from the tobacco settlement was spent on initiatives unrelated to the harm caused by tobacco and unrelated to preventing new initiation of smokers. So the opioid settlement is really clear that you can use this funding to address prevention, treatment, recovery, saving lives. There are principles that were published by Johns Hopkins School of Public Health that are sort of the national guidance related to the best uses. They focus on really clear guidance like using evidence-based practices, spending money to save lives, focusing on prevention, and developing a transparent process for spending funds. So these areas add very nicely to the existing public health efforts around harm reduction, treatment, recovery, support, and prevention. These are part of a comprehensive long-term solution, not only to the opioid crisis, but to reduce harm from all substances in the future. So our strategy includes all of those pieces. It is aligned not only with the Johns Hopkins model, but also was formed in partnership with the Kentucky Opioid Abatement Advisory Commission. That's the state entity that is allocating the state's share of those funds. We're aiming to prioritize the people who are most impacted by the crisis and invest in long-term strategies to prevent opioid-related harm. So, to date, we have allocated 4 times. We're breaking them down into 3 rounds, 1 round being broken into 2 pieces. The first was really trying to stop the bleeding and reduce the number of people who were dying in our community immediately. So those funds went to naloxone distribution, overdose education, outreach, services and priority zip codes, and outreach to our unhoused residents. And that was $1.1 million. The next round, we put out a request for proposals in the area of treatment and recovery supports, homelessness, and prevention. We received over 60 applications, and our opioid abatement advisory board worked to evaluate those and selected ultimately 21 projects from 20 different organizations for a total of $4.8 million of funding. $5 million of the opioid abatement settlement went to existing Louisville Metro government funded programs, including our health department's work in harm reduction and medication for opioid use disorder, EMS's overdose response and the expansion of their crisis call diversion, and the Goodwill Another Way program funded through Office of Social Services. In that first round of funding, one of the projects that had been allocated was working with UK Target 4, a partner that provides services around substance use, and they were going to open a service site providing overdose education, naloxone distribution, harm reduction services, and linkage to treatment for substance use disorder. Ultimately, University of Kentucky was unable to participate in that grant, and so our department proposed that we implement that internal to LMG and fund our health department to carry out that proposal. We believe in the importance of it. We believe in increasing access, particularly to medication for opioid use disorder and harm reduction services to residents. So we allocated the funding that had previously been allocated to UK for that, along with some expanded wraparound services to provide residents who receive services through that site. Just breaking it down by category, as you can see, the overwhelming majority of the funds have gone to treatment and recovery supports. That's not a surprise because that is where our community has the largest number of organizations working. So the majority of the proposals that we received came from our treatment and recovery partners. Those funds were allocated almost entirely in round 2. We also, as you can see, spent funds on emergency services, homelessness, harm reduction, primary prevention, and then administration and evaluation. Evaluation is really emerging as one of the critical expenditures in these abatement settlement dollars. Communities are finding that if you don't build an infrastructure where you have accountability and reporting from the organizations who are receiving funds, then you risk making investments without being able to show constituents and residents the value of those investments. So you all may remember these. These were the round 1 funds that I mentioned, the Save Lives Now. In total, it led to the distribution of over 9,700 units of naloxone, both in our priority zip codes that were experiencing the highest rates of overdose each 6-month period that they were distributed, and in our homeless encampments around the city. We also saw funding for Feed Louisville and CARE that provided outreach to an average of 216 people daily, as well as transporting and transitioning folks into shelter and housing. Round 2, we are fully in progress. All of these partners have grant agreements signed. They have already completed their first quarter reports. They've submitted their first invoices and will continue providing services for about another 8 months to a year, depending on their start dates. While we're still gathering the initial data, we can already report that over 2,750 people have been served for in this round around medication for opioid use disorder, prevention, case management, and other services. 41 people have been moved into permanent supportive housing. 50 professionals have been employed in providing opioid abatement-related work, and $1.3 million of those allocated funds has already gone out the door. Now, it bears mentioning at this point, the payment structure for these grants is reimbursement, so we're always kind of 3 to 4 months behind in our accounting of how many of these dollars have been spent. So we know that organizations have spent much more than this, but this is what's been invoiced and moved from the cost center that has the abatement funds in it. So this round, we really heard from community members, the state abatement board. In every one of the town halls that we attended, we heard this theme come up over and over again, was prevention, and really taking a 3-part approach to prevention. Number 1 is what many people think of when they hear the word prevention. That's primary prevention. It's often in classrooms, in schools, in after-school programs, but it is implementing proven practices that reduce the initiation of substance use by young people. We also consider prevention as being a little broader. So we recognize that untreated mental illness and untreated trauma in young people is highly correlated with subsequent initiation of substance use and problematic substance use, all the way up to substance use disorder. So we really also want to highlight the need for better mental health care, better linkage to services for high-risk young people who have experienced trauma or who are experiencing mental illness and don't currently have access to mental health services. And then lastly, the third is more of an environmental goal. So recognizing that young people exist in an environment and that the best way that we can ensure their health and their stability is by making sure that they have access to meaningful extracurricular activities and a place that they can be that is safe and free of harm. So our strategy is, as I said, aligned with Johns Hopkins, the state priorities, feedback we've received from this body, and feedback we've received from the community. So there have been a few projects that have been already funded around prevention, but that is the area that we've funded the least so far. So in this disbursement, we're hoping to prioritize some school-based projects. That's the broadest opportunity for us to reach young people in Jefferson County. And JCPS, with 100,000 students, is sort of the easiest, largest institution we can partner with to ensure we're reaching as many young people as possible. So the proposal that we have centers around those 3 areas that we discussed before: classroom evidence-based prevention programming, behavioral health services like mental health care, linkage to treatment for both mental illness and substance use disorder, and then some after-school wraparound social emotional learning programming. There's a huge evidence base for youth prevention, school-based prevention, primary prevention. It's incredibly cost-effective. If you're able to prevent a young person from developing a substance use disorder, that is far and away the cheapest way to deal with a substance use disorder. all of the cost-benefit analyses of the evidence-based programming that we are advocating JCPS implement show a huge return on investment. So it's estimated that for every $1 that you spend on prevention, you save $18 down the line in medical care costs, treatment costs, homelessness costs, and incarceration costs. Long-term investment for long-lasting impact. The services that we're hoping to fund in JCPS will ultimately be able to be sustainable through Medicaid billing. A lot of the students who would be reached through this, especially the psychiatric nurse practitioner hours, are students who are either on Medicaid or eligible for Medicaid, and JCPS will be able to bill those moving forward, so we no longer are on the hook for providing those services. We also are really looking forward to building infrastructure within JCPS. There are many good community-based organizations that want to provide services in JCPS using their own funding, but playing matchmaker between school and organization has been a barrier, and there's no dedicated capacity within JCPS to identify, okay, instead of it just being this teacher knows somebody who does this, so that school has a program, which schools have what needs and what programs are providing those, and link those in future assortments. We also recommend in continuing to invest in these evidence-based practices around youth prevention and addressing social determinants of health.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start us with a couple questions, and then the queue is open if anyone has questions. I think the first thing I would, and again, we had a conversation between, I'm the primary sponsor, so we had a conversation about what this looks like and what it would do, and a bit of a conversation around the prevention piece and the evolution of the prevention, the evolution of the problem that we're seeking to prevent, right? So to your point, we're not seeing folks becoming addicted to opioids through the pharmaceutical process, right? Like doctors are no longer, the prescriptions aren't really the problem anymore, at least not as much the problem, right? So can you talk a little bit about the evolution, about how, I think you know what I'm asking. Yeah. Thanks, Ben.
I'm happy for the opportunity to discuss that. So yes, as the chair says, we don't see young people initiating prescription drug use with pills that are coming from a pharmacy nearly to the extent that we did 20 years ago when there were tons of prescriptions being written for opioids. However, as I discussed with the waves of the crisis, because of that funding, because of that flooding of our community with prescription drugs, our drug supply now is fundamentally and permanently altered. So what we have seen for the first time, to my knowledge, in this community's history is young people experiencing opioid overdose at school, young people dying of opioid overdose in our community, not because they're taking a Vicodin or a Percocet or an OxyContin, but because they're taking a pill that they believe to be a prescription pill, but is in fact synthetic opioids, usually illicitly manufactured fentanyl. So the abatement settlement is really clear, like the tobacco settlement, but much clearer, that preventing the harm that the opioid crisis has caused includes making sure that young people are not dying of opioid overdoses today when they initiate substance use of any sort. So primary prevention is wonderful because it can reduce not only negative outcomes related to one particular substance, but related to all substance use, as well as a number of negative health outcomes like suicide prevention or self-harm, smoking, vaping. But because we know young people are accessing illicitly manufactured opioids in our community, recognizing that fact and trying to get as much information to young people and as much reduction in risk out to our schools has become a priority for us. So we're already in a number of JCPS schools. We're in a number of private schools. But right now, it's all sort of our department's work is idiosyncratic. If there's a school that will let us in, we go in. If there's a school that hears about us through word of mouth, we go. But our dream is to have sort of a more systemic intervention where every young person in Jefferson County is receiving fact-based information, not scare tactics, but fact-based information about the risks associated with substance use and information about how to protect themselves.
Thank you. So just, from my perspective, I don't want us to, and I know we've had this conversation, I don't want us to lose focus on, what the opioid crisis was and is and what it means for us going forward. At the same time, we have to at least be aware that there's this parallel track. So we have to acknowledge that and keep an eye on what that looks like. What this does today is help JCPS with programs that, and again, I heard you say, that the goal here is that we put the money in and that these programs will begin and then they'll be funded through insurance recovery and through other programs. And so this is not an ongoing, every year we can expect to spend another $1.6 million. We know this is an issue. We know there are folks out there that are doing these kinds of things. We know that they're having some success at it. And we also know that there are ways to fund pieces of it, right? Maybe not all of it, but certainly pieces, which gives us a chance then to double back to some of the, not the prevention piece, but the rehabilitation piece. And recognizing and understanding that no one who goes into treatment, well, I should say no one, rarely do people go into treatment and come out on the other side and they're finished after one effort, right? So we know that this is an ongoing, and so we know we have to keep focusing on supporting. And so I was hoping you, and again, I'm just highlighting some of the things that you had mentioned. You point out that there's a lot of money in this particular ordinance to do the evaluation piece. I would remind my colleagues who've been around for, well, Councilwoman McCraney and maybe Councilman Winkler. Other than that, I can't say my colleagues have been around for a while. Were you here when we did the living room? Yeah, I was elected at the same time they were. Oh, then, okay. Then Councilman Piagentini. So we we funded a program, for historic sake, we funded a program called the Living Room, and we were really excited about what that might look like. But some of the struggle we had was there wasn't enough clear evaluation of the program to identify whether it was successful or not. And so it became a bit of a problem. So making sure that evaluation piece is in there, I just want to reiterate to my colleagues, making sure that evaluation piece is in there makes a difference. Because if you can't show that it's successful, it's hard to keep doing it, right? So so I just would point that out. Having said that, those are my pieces. Did I say anything that creates discomfort with my guests? Is there anything?
No, I think it's worth clarifying, just in the interest of transparency, the Medicaid funding, and the reimbursement, that would make the service component sustainable, and that is the most expensive part, and certainly, the time of a psychiatric nurse practitioner is much more expensive than a prevention specialist or education specialist. But our hope around the classroom-based prevention programming is that the infrastructure gets built so that community partners can come in and provide those services free of charge, because they would like to do that and they're just struggling to do.
Great, thank you. Questions from members of the committee? Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, you can't see the queue at all. It's weird. Yeah. So thank you very much for being here. Thanks for answering some questions. First of all, I want to come back to, and we don't have to bring the slides back up if you want to, that's fine. You talked about metrics, as in how many people have gotten permanent housing. I actually think that's a good outcome metric, right? The others, I'll call them activity metrics, right? We've trained so many people to do this job, or we, set up this program and we have this many programs going right now and things like this. We're at this point, as I'm doing the math in my head, sort of back of the napkin, we've committed about 20% of the funds, right? 10 million out of 50 million. Am I, give or take $1 million bucks, right? Yeah. So I'm curious as to where we think we are and what outcomes we're tracking. And by outcomes, I'm thinking things like a reduction in deaths per 100,000, a reduction in people addicted to drugs, right? Maybe measured through the amount of people going through inpatient rehabilitation. I don't know, I'm making this up on the fly, but what outcome metrics like that are we tracking, and where are we right now in seeing any results?
So definitely, I agree 100%. The outcome for the first round especially, but honestly for all of the rounds that I'm most interested in is number of lives saved.
Right.
And we are very, very closely tracking overdose fatalities. As I mentioned before, we only have provisional data, so I'm not authorized to speak on 2024, but I would love for us to come back when those numbers
Okay.
are released
That's
in
good.
June or July. I can say safely we are anticipating dramatic outcomes that we'll
Okay.
be able to point to.
Yeah.
And in terms of sort of round two, the outcomes related to that, we're not yet at a point where we'll be able to capture those, but part of the evaluation is aimed at those longer-term pieces of did we make an impact on the community?
Yeah. Again, my fear, just to be clear, my fear on these things is $50 million later, we look back and we say, what did we do? And we can't put our finger on it, right? So what you just said, because I got to tell you, I turned around and said it to Councilman Owen here a moment ago, the chart on deaths per 100,000, I mean, it makes me want to throw up, right? Like it's a chart, but, there's humanity behind the chart. It's very, very hard to watch. So I'm glad to hear that, again, we'll see how it goes, but it sounds like going in the right direction. That's excellent. Regarding the youth portion of this and the prevention side of it, I'm a little jaded on prevention just because there's been prevention programs in the past that have been true failures, right? And so I guess I just have two questions on it. My first question is, what's the difference in this, and you said this evidence-based program, and what is the evidence, so what's the difference in how it's structured compared to like past programs? And then what's the kind of evidence that you have, or that those studies have that show that it's different, or what impact it has down the road?
Absolutely. So I am a graduate of the DARE program. That was my generation.
Right.
That was like a perfect example of a non-evidence-based
Right.
program. So it was people who were not experts in education or child psychology or substance use or any of the areas that you would want someone to know about in designing a program.
Right.
It was well-intentioned.
Of course.
But scare tactics ultimately tend to backfire. So when I was told that if I smoked cannabis, even once, that I would, live a life of addiction and I would wind up unhoused, and then I saw people all around me using
Right.
substances in a way that didn't play out that I had been told, it undermined all of the credibility of what that program was saying. So the evidence-based models, really, there are a couple of different approaches, but what they all have in common is they're rigorously tested. So when they implement those programs, they first sort of take measurements of the student body, of who already reports substance use, who reports knowledge about substances. At the end of the implementation, they do a post-evaluation. So they ask questions, again, about who's using substances, but importantly, about people's knowledge level around substances, around facts versus myths, around resources. And to be evidence-based, you need to be able to show that the information that you're trying to convey is conveyed, and then the best programs have longitudinal data where they then track those kids and they say, okay, well, that's fine, but then what about when they get out into the world?
Right.
And they look, either at one school that received the intervention and another school that didn't, or one class that received it and another that didn't, and they track those exact outcomes that you would care most about. Did young people initiate substance use? Did young people experience negative health outcomes? Did young people have involvement with the legal system, or were they expelled or suspended from school for substance use? And we, as a health department, are only promoting programs that have had multiple studies where different researchers have been able to point to a statistically significant improvement in the outcomes that we care most about.
Okay.
So the state has 2 that they recommend that have large evidence bases. Those aren't the only 2 programs, so there are others that we would also encourage JCPS to do. But we have JCPS's commitment that they will look to our department as the sort of knowledge base for what is likely to work, as opposed to what feels like it will work.
Last question. The only thing that makes me a little, we're talking about going directly to kids here, and okay, but there's this group of people called parents that usually sit in between. Now, I will caveat that we have, I'll simplify this very easily, but we'll have kids that don't have parents in their lives for whatever reason. They're in the foster care system currently, right, or the state custodial system. Might have kids whose parents themselves are addicted. Very high-risk group probably, right, if not the most high-risk group. And then we're going to have kids, right, the vast majority, they're going to have some parent at home, parent or parents, right, and all this. So help me understand how these programs engage with them. At a minimum, make sure that they're not in the dark about what's going on, and at a maximum, knock on wood, I like to think that part of the reason I didn't go down that pathway is my parents guided me there, not so much my school. But, again, conceding there are high-risk groups that we have parents that aren't maybe giving that same education to their children, and we have a role to play to help out here. But I also don't want to ignore that. So how are we partnering with parents or engaging with them? Can you explain how that works?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that parents are a critical piece of the puzzle.
Right.
I think this particular package is focused on services and programming for young people, but our department already does parent education, and I think it would be very wise of us as a city to invest future pieces of the opioid abatement in parent education as well. The evidence base there is a little, the effects are present, but it's a little bit more challenging, as you can imagine. The young people who are at highest risk are also the young people who it's hardest to engage parents to come to
100%.
Programming.
Right.
But I'm 100% in support of us providing as much education as possible. I'm a parent, and for me, it's terrifying. And I feel really, really privileged and lucky that I have the subject matter expertise and the knowledge to at least go into this aware of what the risks are for my child and how to talk to my child, and knowing that talking with my child about substance use is not going to put the idea in her head and cause her to experiment with substances, but it will provide her meaningful facts that she can use to make good decisions.
Yeah, and this is something that globally I've asked about with other programs, with other departments, right, where we're engaging with youth. I get very nervous that we're missing a step here. Again, with that said, there are, I'm sure, many children, and the highest risk children are probably in circumstances where they don't have that level of parental influence, right? But those that do, I just always want to make sure that there's some engagement there at a minimum, at a knowledge base, at a maximum, they're carrying the message forward, right? They've got, because they're spending by far the most time with their child. So,
and that third piece that we talked about with the prevention strategy of the environment, really that aims to address not only the parents, but having meaningful relationships with trusted adults as well. So already some of the prevention work that we've already funded was sort of getting some prevention work into existing sports leagues and situations where it's young people who maybe they're not going to their parent for this information, but they have a coach who's able to play that role in their life. And I think that area is another opportunity where we can expand our work.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Councilwoman, Parrish Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate your presentation. This is something that I think we need to do over and over again for the wider council body, because when we talk about abatement funding, we don't talk about that this is 18 years that this money will be distributed. And we look at the amount, and if you break that $50 million down, it's really not a lot of funding. And so just listening to this part of it, I thought about, I'm one of those survivors of all those adverse childhood experiences, but even today, it's a lot of discrimination based on substances and the types of substances people use. So functioning alcoholics, I see them everywhere, in every level of government and every level of our communities, but they are aware of their services that are out there. They're aware of prevention and treatment, and there's these options. There's no cookie cutter way to kind of solve all of these issues, but this is, in fact, blood money that people died in our state and many places like it have suffered for a long time. And so it's important to me that as we come up with these strategies on how to allocate it, that prevention should be a part of that, because nothing works on the dead. If somebody's dead, it just doesn't work. Saving lives, and I'm glad you acknowledged that, should be our priority no matter what. And given that, as we see, it's not just people with single-parent homes or coming from poor and marginalized neighborhoods, there are people from affluent homes who are taking what they think are aspirin or some pain reliever from a friend and finding out that nothing is pure and these things have been duplicated so much. So that is the scariest to me, because some people think that their communities won't be touched by this. Overdoses are still happening. I know the reduction is going down. They're still happening. So with that happening and nothing being pure, I want to make sure that we don't get away from the original things that you all did. I don't know how you plan to cycle this out in the next 18 years, but I would like to know that you're still going to go back to make sure that these smaller organizations that are on the ground dealing with this issue are getting funding too, because I see a lot of supplanting of this funding to fund things that in positions that were already funded by our government, and now we want to supplant it because we have this money that's coming over 18 years, which we all agree isn't enough money. So I do like the emphasis on more support for mental health services, but I also want to make sure that medically assisted treatment doesn't get lost in that. So my question is, like the chair talked about with the living room, we didn't give it enough time. We're good at starting pilot programs and projects, but we have to invest in them over time. So just as this money is going to be distributed over 18 years, we need to make sure that everything that you've been supporting and you all have been advocating for gets that same amount of support. But prevention should already be woven into that. So not saying this isn't a good part of the plan at this stage right now. I just want to make sure the other things you did that you have basically explained worked, get the same support going down the line, because this is, is this being distributed like 2 or 3 times a year? Is it 2 times or 3 times?
The schedule has been really unpredictable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll pause there. But whenever it's being distributed, you might have to go back and reorder those priorities based on that, but making sure that you weave in there. So to get to my question, I noticed that encampment outreach was on here. This is something I'm very passionate about. I never hid it. Housing stabilization, employment opportunities. Those three things to me don't seem to be fleshed out. What I worry about is that we have the same usual suspects that get all of the funding in our city. And I know it's because some of them are bigger outfits and they're able to offer and diversify and assign people to do it. But there are some smaller entities that we are not encouraged to apply for this funding, which really should, that are doing the work on the ground. So I want to know, in this part, what does the encampment outreach look like? Because what I've seen is encampment clearings or what are labeled relocations, what are really clearings, what does that look like? And then the housing stabilization, is that for transitional ongoing housing when people need support because they come out of treatment? If you all don't know, I just got a message earlier today, someone's coming out of treatment after 6 months and they don't have a place to live. And you know, as you talked about environment, if you don't change the environment, if they can't change the environment they're going back to, the likelihood of them coming back and having to deal with another issue is increased. So what does that look like? And the last thing, I would love for people impacted by the opioid crisis to actually be receiving some of this funding. I know that's hard to water it down to the ground, but the employment opportunity seems like a way to do that. So if you could just briefly say what those 3 things look like.
Absolutely. So in terms of the encampment outreach, that was funding in that first round for what at the time was Feed Louisville. Our department had a spectacular health education specialist who built from the ground up a program to bring harm reduction services into our encampments in partnership with a number of other stakeholders. Unfortunately, one of my favorite LMPHW staff members of all time left our department to work at another local organization. And with the loss of that staff member, we found we did not have capacity to continue our harm reduction outreach services into encampments. So Feed Louisville took that over and sort of brought those services out into camps when we were unable to do it. And then the transition to housing includes a number of different organizations. It includes CARE, operating services at the Arthur Street Hotel. It's work at St. John Center, St. Vincent, and a couple of others. But it's a diversity of approaches that they're taking, all the way from, no barrier, housing first, provision of rooms to people who are in immediate need, all the way up to sort of that full process through to permanent supportive housing. And then I apologize, the third question.
Thank you for that. The third question was around employment opportunities, and then I see Deputy Mayor Nicole George stepped up about the encampment outreach. So the employment, how is this going to get to the people impacted most, and where that connects to the employment opportunities that are listed, and then the encampment outreach?
Sure. So definitely it's a best practice to recruit and hire people with lived experience. Some of the positions funded by opioid abatement were explicitly set out for certified peer support specialists. Others just happen to have the good luck to recruit people who have lived experience. I definitely think there's lots of room still around building capacity in our recovery workforce. And that's something our department is continuing to work on. And I think future allocations would be a great opportunity to shore that up and expand.
Deputy Mayor George, if you'd introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chair. And that does, Councilmember Parrish-Wright, give us something interesting to think about around workforce development. So certainly noted. I would just take this opportunity to remind everyone that your general dollars go to support a tremendous amount of outreach or connection that happens in the community thanks to our Office of Social Services. So as a reminder, our Office of Social Services has the Homeless Services Division. That includes very strong outreach and connection every day into our encampments, in addition to encampment response, which is a much smaller team devoted to assessing risk in encampments.
Thank you. Councilman Linenger.
In a similar vein, I feel that the $1.6 million for Jefferson County Public Schools for the prevention youth program, which I agree is something, we can look at what has already been spent, and we're spending as much on evaluation as we are on direct youth prevention right now, which we need to correct. But that's, in your presentation, it's very clear what we're going to do, and you've answered beautifully, in my opinion, about evidence-based practices and how we can improve on failures of the past. In youth prevention, the $700,000 to contract with a third party to create a district court diversion program for individuals cited and arrested for unlawful camping. I would like to know more than just that sentence, or even clause rather, about what we're planning to spend $700,000 on.
Excuse me. Yeah. Thank you. So I think it's really important that as we think about diversion, understanding first that, our goal in this is really to, one, enhance efficiency within the unlawful camping docket, and two, be able to maximize connection and create that point of intervention for people who want it. This is one tool of diversion offered to people who will come before the court, right? So this is one tool and one form of intervention. Diversion will include services like screening and assessment. And for those who screen in or are found to have abuse or dependency, treatment services would be provided for treatment. That could also include, for those who maybe don't have or aren't found to have had dependence or abuse, that would include support services involving case management, for instance. So the idea is that the diversion would go out in a competitive bid, and so we would be drafting that RFP, and folks would be bidding on that based on what they can provide.
And, sort of in line with Councilwoman Parrish Wright's point about, that this is blood money, because it is. And, I've been pretty honest with people about this out in the community before I was elected, so I might as well be honest in chamber. The opioid crisis has directly impacted my family. So what I'm hearing is part of that $700,000 would not go towards services, strictly speaking, addressing the opioid crisis. Instead, we're addressing the need for the docket created by House Bill 5 and the unlawful camping. This is part of, at least some part of this $700,000 is addressing not the opioid crisis or prevention or anything to do with the opioid crisis, but is instead addressing the unlawful camping.
So let me be clear, and I'll defer to my public health colleagues, but I think part of what we hope to see, again, is for people who we know are at greater risk of substance abuse and dependency, and particularly for folks who are living on the streets who, as I understand it, are more likely to be subjected to an overdose and not be treated, that these services would be offered to them. So again, the idea is that this is a point of intervention. This diversion tool is not for everyone. It will be for a certain individual who meets the criteria and wants to do this as an option in working with their counsel. And as part of that, those services, again, would involve screening and assessment, and then the support services that they need, whether that's treatment or case management or whatever gets them hopefully to more healthy, stable situation, that's what the goal is. But I think there is a real clear connection in that. Again, for people who are living on the streets and are at risk, they're certainly not at risk just for dependence, but also for overdose. And I don't know if there's anything additional or...
Yeah, I mean, generally anyone using unregulated substances is at risk of opioid overdose, and unhoused folks who are not intending to use opioids, not setting out to use opioids, may not have an opioid use disorder, are at heightened risk for overdose. So any interventions that reduce that risk of overdose would be considered allowable under the settlement agreement.
And I don't think it would shock anyone in the chamber to say that I'd like to open up the vault and spend more on prevention and on housing and on all sorts of things, on social services. But again, to Councilwoman Parrish Wright's point, this is a very limited pool of money that we are, as we've just covered, already 20% of the way through. And I guess I just feel that $700,000 does not have the level of detail that the 1.6 million did, and so I'm a little hesitant on that part. But thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Parker.
Yes, thank you. I know you guys mentioned detailing outcomes, and I think it was mentioned that at this point in time that you didn't really or couldn't share your measurable outcomes. So whenever you can do that, I think a lot of us would like to have some detail as far as what different organizations and agencies are actually, like how many they're serving and what their relapse rate is, what their success rate is. And well, just off the cuff, do you have any idea how many organizations we are funding?
Yes, it's between 23 and 27.
Okay, so it'd be nice to know like which ones have a greater success rate and naturally which ones don't. I mean, I would like to see like what the recidivism rate is, or the relapse rate is. I think that would be helpful information, and also that broken down for each organization. And maybe things like, were people unemployed? Have they gained employment? Have they relapsed? Are they finishing school? I mean, you haven't really shared what things you're looking at. So I'll just give you a few of mine. And so I guess that's really all I wanted to ask was the number of agencies and then the comment of what type of outcomes we're looking at.
And I think to date, I can say presently, to my knowledge, no treatment provider in Jefferson County routinely reports their success rates or rate of relapse, return to use, in part because those numbers are incredibly difficult to track. So if somebody completes a course of treatment here and then returns to use and goes to a different provider or returns to a different state or county, sort of having the capacity to do a longitudinal study and track people down even 6 to 12 months after completion of treatment.
Would there be a way to give each person like an anonymous tag number that's shared between, that remains private, but that's shared between organizations?
I would require building a fair amount of infrastructure that would cost additional money to what we've already budgeted for assessment.
Okay. I guess it's just something to think about. Just to, help track our statistics.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Okay, Councilman Parrish Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to follow up. Looking at this, and I've went over it a couple times, my biggest question is around that $700,000 because I've seen how that kind of funding, when it's not spelled out, can just go to the same folks, and I really want to see it make a difference. I really want to see it get closest to the ground. I do want to reiterate that not everybody that is homeless is using substances or opioids. I am an example of that. And not everybody that is homeless is going to citation court, which was created by House Bill 5, the Safer Kentucky Act, which it seems like we pick and choose what parts of that bill that we want to push for. So we're pushing for the aggressive citations, and now we're creating a court, and we want to use the blood money from the opioid crisis to fund some of the services that are happening when the courts have said it hasn't cost them much more money. And we already have groups that are connected to it that are working to help make sure people are connected to services and care. House Bill 5 also has a part in there that says cities are allowed to create their own outdoor encampments and other services. And if we're going to spend $700,000, why aren't we spending that to lift up some of the other programs that we have that are helping people get housed? I mean, I saw where Arthur Street Hotel, Feed Louisville, Hope Village, and all of them are actually helping people get into housing much faster than the city has in the last 2 years. And then, but what we do see is that the most encampment clearings, and we're using that as a talking point now to say that encampments are down, but homelessness is not down. And so if we're going to use this money that's slated for the opioid crisis and people impacted by it, why are we using it to fund something that our state legislators put forth and they didn't put any real structure or real funding to support? And now we're funding a problem that was created and astravated by them. It was already here, but it was astravated and fueled by what they did. So what is the end game here? Do we still keep doing these clearings and relocations and spending the money that way and keep assessing the problem that we know is there? We've had enough evidence-based studies and practices that have shown us what works and what don't work. Why aren't we using this opportunity to fund more of that? I am for most parts of this. I have mixed feelings about Casey's Law because that's forced treatment and there's a lot of lack of understanding around it, but I can deal with the support of that. What I can't deal with is this $700,000, and I don't know how this part could be separated out, and so we can vote for the majority of where this funding should go. I have some real concerns about where this is going to go. Who's going to come out of that RFP process? Is it going to be VOA again? Is it going to be these same folks who are not on the ground doing the work that these other organizations, some of which you're funding now, are doing?
Okay, thank you. couple things to think about. One, you are correct that every person who would come before the unlawful camping docket would not be someone that has an abuse or dependence around chemicals, and specifically opioids. With that being said, that's why this is one tool and one form of diversion, and for that, it is one point of intervention. So as part of this, and forgive me, I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but I believe what is spelled out in there is, again, funding to support screening and assessment, facilitation of support services, and treatment for those who need it. So if someone is not found to, again, need treatment, then that would go to fund support services for things like case management. I would imagine that as part of the RFP process, I would hope we would get, it would be as competitive as possible, and that we would get a lot of providers who are interested in that. I'm just going to say House Bill 5 is with us. Whether we do this or not, there will be an unlawful camping docket. This is a point of intervention, and it is one tool for for folks who meet criteria, folks in working with their counsel, as everyone is entitled, to be able to take that as an opportunity. Again, understanding that not everyone who comes before will necessarily fall into the criteria for treatment, but they would be at risk. I think I answered the questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Piagentini.
Thank you. First of all, just to specifically address something, many of the organizations that were mentioned by my colleague from District 3 were like the Hope Village, for example. I mean, they were funded by Metro Council. So, these organizations didn't just like organically spring up out of the dirt. They got big funding from us. And we've spent, I think, millions. I mean, it's in the tens of millions of dollars, I think, at this point, at least since I've been on council, on beefing up service, particularly transitional housing, right? Like temporary housing, the transitional housing for people that are experiencing homelessness. So, and look, we need to continue to improve that. I've met with Deputy Mayor George on how to be more strategic and make sure that is all working together. But just to make sure, you're still there, okay. Just to come back to this diversion program. I mean, first of all, I want to say I appreciate your comment about, like, look, we have to live in Realville. We might disagree with the General Assembly on specific policy issues, but once it's implemented, we're living in the society we live in, and we have to address it. I'm looking at SAMHSA data, okay? So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they're like the gold standard on housing data around substance use and mental health. And they point out, quote, and I'm quoting here, one study found that homeless people, quote, SAMHSA points out that people who are homeless have a high risk of overdose from illicit substances, One study found that homeless people had a higher risk of opioid overdose with an adjusted risk rate of 1.8% for homeless versus 0.3% for low-income people who had housing. It's literally saying they have I'm just doing the math in my head, like a 600%, a 6x increased risk for illegal drug use, right, and ultimately overdose. 100%, not 100% of people who are homeless. That is not true. But 2/3 of homeless people, I'm quoting SAMHSA again, I'm not making this up, have a lifetime history of drug or alcohol use disorders. So I'm understanding, I mean, again, we have to go where we think the highest risk is, and I think what you're attempting to do there, right, is take folks that are caught up in this system that, again, we didn't create, it was created, but we have to enforce the law, and then we're taking them and saying, okay, there are options here, and if, there is a fairly high percentage, I mean, it's not a tiny percentage, that may have risks here, and we're taking them and moving them into treatment programs and moving them into services. That's the point here, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Point of intervention, yes, for
Right.
those for whom it would benefit.
And just out of curiosity, is the only thing we're doing related to that point of intervention related to substance use prevention or rehabilitation, or is it also connection with other services, housing, right, maybe mental health stability, all these other things?
Yes. So again, One of the things you'll hear, and you'll certainly hear from our courts, is that this is one form of diversion, one form of services. There's currently informal diversion being offered from an array of service providers. Our Homeless Services Division also sits in the courtroom. So again, this is one tool for one part of the population.
And I guess my point is I'm confused about why that's even remotely controversial, because, again, what I hear you doing is, somebody's gotten cited, again, on a law that we didn't even create, but we have to enforce the law, and we are trying to prevent them from going into maybe, the long-term implications of that citation and then divert them into these programs. I remember doing this during COVID related to diversion programs related to people that were at risk for evictions, right? To me, it seems like a very humane way to try to get people out of the sort of, hamster wheel of issues and move them into programming, right? Am I missing something here?
Yes, no.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chair.
Councilman Winkler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Councilman Piagentini made many of my points. And I think, really the key with this program, from my perspective, right, is Councilman Parrish Wright's absolutely right. Not everybody who's homeless has substance abuse issues, and not everybody who has substance abuse issues is homeless. However, there are a significant portion of the population that are. I was just reviewing, we get a monthly report from Another Way program, and part of what they do is a qualitative assessment and ask the individual, what at least is, maybe not the exact cause, but at least a contributing factor to their homelessness. And time again, you see, substance abuse, doesn't necessarily say opioids, it could be alcohol as well. So we'll use substance abuse broadly, but is it a contributing factor, if not a causal factor? And so I think, to Councilman Piagentini's point, having a program available to meet them where they are, to try to help alleviate the challenge of addiction, I think is a good use of funds, and hopefully help continue them on the path to recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one comment on the topic at hand, then I wanted to ask Mr. Goldman a question. I would point out that none of the programs that we're funding tonight are limited exclusively to folks who are impacted by the opioid crisis. So to single out the $700,000 and say that not all of that is directly affecting, well, none of it is directly affecting only folks affected by the opioid crisis. What we've done is we've identified a population, an audience, if you will, where there is a great risk, where we recognize that there is a substantial portion of that population that were in fact affected by this, and we're reaching out to that population. And once we reach out to that population, if somebody in that population doesn't fit neatly into our little box of opioid crisis, we're not going to exclude them and say, oh no, we can't help you, this was opioid money. Once we've identified them, because we created the process, we can't then go in and say, no, we're not going to help you. So the $700,000 that we're talking about recognizes, again, and I'm going to stop because I don't want to reiterate everything that my colleagues have said, but I do think it's important to recognize that it's not I don't think it's beneficial, even if it were possible, to go in and say to specific individuals who are being assisted, we're not going to help you because you don't fit. It just doesn't seem appropriate to me. So that's kind of where I would leave that. Mr. Goldman, earlier when you were speaking about, and I'm sorry, I'm shifting gears way back. There's no one else in the queue, so you just joined. I'm sorry. When I started my comment, there was no one else in the queue. When we were talking about the education piece, which is the biggest portion of this, the programs are largely funded through JCPS. I thought I heard you say, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to make sure I understood you. In your comment, you talked about a willingness, a desire to work with anybody who's involved in education. So this wasn't like you handpicked JCPS to exclude. It was more that this is where the population is. It's where we can start. But can you speak a little bit to that, the education piece beyond just JCPS?
Sure. So I guess
you.
the distinction is between this proposal and sort of our department's longstanding work around substance use. So we will field any request for us to come speak to anyone in Jefferson County. So we've done parents' nights at public schools. We've done parents' nights at private schools. We've visited classrooms in public schools. We've visited classrooms in private schools. Where we've seen sort of the systemic barrier to large-scale implementation is much more in JCPS just because of the size of the institution and the resources of the institution. So I would certainly, want to amplify our department's willingness if there is any, educational institution, public school, private school, after-school program, community-based organization, we are able to go there. Most of the non-public school systems don't have sort of the same volume of expectations from sort of the system and the stretching of resources. So we found that when we are invited to better resource school systems, it's much easier to deal with the sort of work that needs to go into to collaborate. So on an individual level, we're having great success in individual public and private schools, but there's no system level that we've been successful on.
Thank you. And should that be brought to your attention, I think I'm clarifying. You've identified that there are community partners that are willing to help in certain ways, and it sounds to me like you guys are willing to connect up anybody you can connect up if we can make this work. So if there is a school system outside of JCPS or an individual school, it sounds to me like you're saying, please call us.
Yeah, I would say independently of this funding package,
Right.
please call our health department.
Right.
We'll go to any school in the county.
Because the goal is to get the prevention out there, regardless whether we're paying for it this way or another one. Okay, great, thank you. Councilwoman Parrish-White.
Thank you. I'll keep my comment brief. I do want to say that as Councilman Winkler was ending his speaking on this, I did press it. The system froze up, so that's why it came through later. But I'm not here to play games with people's lives. This is not funny to me. People have been impacted. This money is not philanthropy, and I truly believe that the $700,000 could be spent better. We talked about earlier how 18 years down the road, we don't want to look like we wasted money. I'm just saying this city has done this over and over again where we spin around the same old things instead we have proven things that are working for people. I just want them to get the first consideration before we start a new thing. You already have a process for people to apply for opioid and abatement funding that can very much do everything that Deputy Mayor George talked about. You already have groups that are very well doing everything that Deputy Mayor George talked about. So why aren't we using this opportunity to fund more of those groups instead of just saying, here's another $700,000 here. What will it be next year? Another $1 million. What will it be next year? When we've already said over 18 years, 20% of that is spent. I don't plan to be here in 18 years. But while it's my turn and I'm putting it on record, I do not agree with how some of this has been launched to us, and it isn't spelled out enough. And we all know that the same groups get funded. What are we doing to do something different to make this better? While it's on my watch, I take it very serious because I know how this issue has impacted too many families. It's not laughing matter to me. It is serious that while we have this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to fund the people impacted by this the most, that's what we should be doing. There is nothing being proposed with that $700,000 that isn't already happening. And if you can show me that it's one of those things that isn't already happening, I would like to know what it is. I want to support this wholeheartedly. But I'm hung up on where this $700,000 is going because the supplementation that's not just happening here, all over this nation, people have used opioid abatement funds to fund a ice rink, saying, oh, this will be good, and kids can go skate on the ice rink, and that'll be preventing. And people have used it to paint cars for Juneteenth. That is not what this blood money is for. We need to be good stewards of the money and make sure we're doing right. I don't want to be in opposition every time I speak on this issue. I'm speaking because this is a field of expertise that I come from. And I don't want to play with people's lives while we have this opportunity. I just want to know, out of this, what you're proposing, What isn't already happening? Because connection to services, groups doing wraparound support without money from you all are still already doing this work. How can you lift up what's already happening instead of, like we love to do, start a new thing that won't be invested in the same as we go in the future? I just want to know what with this $700,000 for whatever you're trying to do, what isn't already happening?
Deputy Mayor George.
Thank you, Chair. I would say, first of all, you are correct. Lots of people are already in this space. Lots of people are doing really good work. So what this would be providing, again, is one, more services to a focused population, to a targeted group, and it would be funding those services. So I see a lot of good work happening, informal diversion, at least in the two dockets that have already occurred, but there isn't funding behind that to support. There's no additional dollars and no specific dollars for treatment as I see it. And so with that, I think, again, this is just focusing on a specific group for a point of intervention, and it is additional funding to support the work that, yes, is broadly happening out in the community. The last thing I'm going to say is, again, in the ordinance it talks about, or it should talk about, like assessment, screening and assessment. It should talk about connections, treatment, and social supports around things like case management. If there's something additional that, as we're drafting an RFP, folks want to see considered, we're open to ideas. I think I think there's general consensus that something should involve those three categories. But if there's something additional, we're open to ideas.
Can I just say the addition?
Yes.
As a solution? Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I talked about earlier with finding ways for opportunities for groups you're already funded. Councilman Piagentini said that we funded Hope Village. That was a reimbursement process for a smaller group who don't have buckets of money laying around to pull from until they wait to get funded. All of that support has taken a while to get, and now it's been pulled away as they are on their own process. So I get it. We don't want to fund this outdoor thing. A one-time funding of something is just like what happened with the living room. If you don't continue to support that, it's not going to be, and it's been an amazing thing that they keep a waiting list for, and former President Winkler had us go and volunteer there. They're still trying to thrive and survive, and they could use additional support, but we don't want to do that, right? My thing is, what can be better is, like, let's lift up the groups that are actually doing the work. They have passed the test. They've shown us proven results. Let's make sure we're lifting those up, and they have an opportunity to apply for what you're trying to, add more support to. The other thing is making sure that folks are supported to hire directly impacted people, who, whether it's peer support, whether it's going out to the encampments and helping to make sure that people are connected, make sure that those opportunities are also included in this. My thing is that people are tired of being assessed and report and data reports and all of that stuff, and then not seeing the funding come after that. We know the data. We have the data. He just read Sam's data. Public health has a great deal of data. How much more assessment do we need for a problem that needs more money? If you talk to any therapist, any mental health person, if they were to sum up the main issue that most of the people they see regularly have, it's surrounded by money. So now that we have an opportunity for something that is not philanthropy, it should not be treated as philanthropy, because it isn't. That something that is for people who are dealing with this issue, let's make sure that we're funding the things that are direct, that they say are helpful, that they are working with. We have a lot of examples you just gave here. I'm just saying it's not clearly fleshed out, and even with your explanation, I did not hear something different that wasn't already happening.
Thank you.
Excuse me. I would, just to answer that question, I would say, again, it's not a new service. It's funding the services that we know are needed in the community. And it's, to your point, yes, people, I would imagine, are tired of being screened and assessed. There's the need for treatment dollars, right? There's the need for support dollars, whether that looks like case management or some sort of housing support. I don't want to speak to that specifically, because I think it depends on how the RFP is written and who's willing to do what. It's only $700,000. So I know that sounds like a lot of money. It's a limited amount of money in the way of treatment. But I think, again, that is what's different. It's that we are funding those services. It's not just assessment. It is the treatment component. And I hear you on opportunities to make sure that groups are included, and that we're focused on organizations that have proven results.
Thank you. Councilman Piagentini.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to ask a question of my colleague, Councilman Parrish-Wright. There was accusations thrown around about somebody laughing. I'm curious about, like, who's laughing about this? Because I haven't seen anybody laughing. I see people taking it very seriously.
You want me to respond? I said this is not a laughing matter for me.
Okay, I was confused then, I'm sorry. And then, just a clarified question, whoever can answer. We're not restricting, like the RFP that was sent out, we didn't restrict organizations from responding. So, I mean, I don't want to pick on the Hope Village because we've funded them before. They're doing work in the community. I have no beef with the Hope Village, but just because they were mentioned, were they or any other organizations prevented from responding to these RFPs and having ideas related to services to address this issue?
No, and to be clear, our goal first and foremost is to secure the money, which
Right.
requires council approval. Then we would issue an RFP. And my hope is anybody, again, we would want a competitive process, which means
Right.
we would want to have lots of
Yeah.
choice. What we don't want to have, quite frankly, is part of what my colleague Ben spoke about, where you put out an RFP like we did asking for prevention, and you don't get a lot of choice.
Right, okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to be clear because
No
look,
one has
if
been
any
excluded.
organization was being excluded, that would be an issue. But it sounds like it's an open process. Organizations of any size can respond. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So the items before us, it's been, there's a motion and second. It does require a technical correction, and so I'm going to turn that over to the clerk, I think, for the technical correction.
Yes, sir. Very technical correction. In the title, initially, there were 2 ordinances that were referenced regarding being amended, but the body of the legislation only referenced 1, and it is only 1. And we made that correction per your request before this meeting.
Okay, so it doesn't require any action on our part, just to let you know the title is slightly different. Okay, the ordinance is properly before us, so Madam Clerk, if you please open the voting.
Voting is open. Councilwoman McCraney?
Yes.
Councilwoman Parker?
Yes.
Councilwoman Mulvey Woolridge?
Yes.
Councilwoman Parrish-Wright?
Present.
Councilman Piagentini? Okay. You're good. All right.
Either way, it passed. No, that has to go to old business because it's not unanimous.
Okay. Okay, so the item passes with 8 yes votes and 2 present votes. Unanimous votes go to the consent calendar. Present votes take this to old business. So this will be moved to old business. I would remind my colleagues too, even if it comes out of committee with unanimous support, if a council member at some point wishes to move that off of consent, it's really a simple process. You would just either request it at the committee of the whole, or you could request it of the clerk's office. So that consent is not automatically, the consent calendar is not an automatic. Okay, so that goes to the council on old business. The next item is ordinance. Oh, thank you for your presentation. Sorry, appreciate that. The next item is 061, Ordinance 6125. It is an ordinance amending Ordinance 100, Series 2024, relating to the fiscal year 2024-2025 operating budget by transferring $20,000 from Neighborhood Development Fund District 3 to Louisville Metro Council General Operations District 3. I need a motion.
Motion.
Probably motion and seconded. The item is before us. I believe the representative from District 3 is in council chambers, and so she'd like to speak to this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I need to move funding over to be able to take care of some things under our cost budget. We had some overage that I've dealt with. We've reported on having money left in our capital that was for projects that we're going to fund this year. But this is so that we can have some operational funding in our cost center.
Seeing no one in the queue, apparently no questions. No one who's joining us online. All right, this is an ordinance calling for a roll call vote. Madam Clerk, if you please open the voting.
Councilwoman McCraney? Councilwoman Parker? I see you there, I'm sorry. Councilwoman Mulvey Woolridge?
Yes.
Councilwoman McCraney?
Yes.
Councilman Winkler?
Yes.
Councilman Piagentini? Okay, thank you. You have 10 yes votes, Chair.
10 yes votes, and it is unanimous, so this will go to the consent calendar. That was the last item on the agenda, so unless someone has something they want to speak to very quickly, without objection, we are adjourned.